In this video, I'm going to be focusing on the 11.5-inch wide tire and why so many tire manufacturers are now offering it in addition to a 12.5 in the same overall diameter. All right, let's get to it. Now, to get as close to an apples to apples comparison as I can, I'm going to be using two 37-inch tall Nitto Recon Grappler ATs. Both of these have the same tread depth, are made for a 17-inch wheel, and both have a load range D sidewall. So why does the 1150 even exist? Well, what it's really doing is filling a void for people that want to maintain a factory wheel. Not only are aftermarket wheels really expensive these days, but you can get away with a lot with a stock wheel, so why get rid of it if you're happy with it and you don't really need an aftermarket wheel? There's a lot of benefits of staying with a factory wheel. It's going to keep the tire tucked underneath the vehicle, so you're not going to get as much sling on the outside. It also is going to keep that factory scrub radius, so your handling is not really going to change as opposed to going with an aftermarket wheel. Now, why an 1150? Why not just stay with the old standard 1250 and let people just run a slightly wider tire on the narrower wheel? People have been doing that for decades, and it's not that big of a deal in that it works, but it's not ideal in that there are some serious trade-offs to doing that. Now, the big challenge is when you run too wide of a tire on a narrow wheel, so most factory wheels are around 7 inches wide, the tire starts to crown and it becomes very difficult for you to run street pressure and actually have full contact pattern of that tire. So what you have to do to actually make that work is reduce the air pressure in the tire, and that's going to rob you performance. That's going to hurt your load range capability on something like a big 1-ton truck. It's also going to give up some stability, and it's going to impact your steering. When you have lower air pressure and you're turning, that wheel will start to sort of pivot inside of the tire versus having full air pressure. It'll keep that steering a little bit more responsive. So there is a lot of negatives that tire manufacturers know that most people don't really consider they're willing to trade off on. So tire manufacturers said, all right, if people want a 35 or a 37, but they need to keep their stock wheel, we'll just make a slightly narrower tire.
Now, it's easy to talk about the theoretical differences between a 1250 and an 1150, but I found real-world experience is always best. For the past year, I've been running a 37 by 1250 R17 Nitto Recon Grappler AT on my 23 Ford F-150 Raptor R. I've actually had this all-terrain on a few vehicles in the past, and for the price, performance, and durability, I think it's a great tire. I personally really like the wheels that came on the Raptor, so I kept them when I upgraded my tires. Given the wheel is a 17 by 8.5, it's actually a good width that could accommodate either an 11.5 or 12.5 inch wide tire. At the time, I didn't even consider an 11.5 because I didn't think it was necessary. The reason I even went down this rabbit hole and why we're here today is because of one of my main complaints with this truck, and that is the steering feels heavy. Keep in mind that Ford actually changed the steering ratio in these trucks in 24, so I don't think I'm being overly picky with my complaint. While I knew it might be a bit of a long shot, I decided to see if moving down to an 11.5 inch wide tire could improve the steering feel. Even better, I found that the 11.5 was 5 pounds lighter than the 12.5 inch wide version. 5 pounds might not seem like much, but when it comes to rotating mass, it makes a big difference. Since the factory wheels are considered beadlock capable, I did have to pull the beauty rings before having the new tires installed. I ordered my tires through my local off-road shop, Low Range 4x4 here in Wilmington, North Carolina. So I took my truck there for the install. Thankfully, like usual, everything went smoothly and the tires took very little weight to balance. Post-install, I did drive the truck back home and reinstall the rings. Quick tip on those, always use anti-seize on the hardware and be mindful not to over-torque these bolts. These are just beauty rings, not actual functioning beadlock rings, and they don't need a tremendous amount of torque to keep them in place.
Okay, so I want to get on the road and just kind of go over some thoughts about how this actually made the truck drive different from a 1250 to an 1150. And what I will tell you is, yes, the 1150 feels lighter. It feels more responsive. It made the steering a step in the right direction. I still feel like on the interstate, the steering is heavier than I would like it to be, but it's a really genuine move in the right direction, so I'm happy. I typically drive this thing in comfort, and I feel like moving to the 1150 made a difference, so it wasn't a complete waste. So yes, I can say that actually worked. Now, one thing I wanted to do, come out to the beach, because I know that's going to be an area that people are probably curious, because that's where narrow is always kind of supposed to be the worst. Now, I'm at full street pressure right now, so that is 38 psi. Now, ideally on the beach, you want to air down the tires because that's going to let it float a little bit better. So I'm not going to do that. And the reason is I want to do worst case scenario. Like when I drive this truck out with the 1250, I never have an issue with it. So 4 high, Baja mode, it gets you that nice exhaust roar to it as well. And you know, the school of thought has always been, especially with a wider tire for the sand, it makes it float on top a little bit easier. I grew up here in coastal North Carolina driving on the beach, and if you're used to driving on the sand, you can kind of get away with it pretty easily. I had Recon Grapplers on my Ram, which was a 2014 Cummins powered truck, and that was probably one of the few vehicles where I would always air down before I came out here, because that thing was just so heavy that you really needed to. Now hopefully this isn't making anyone sick watching this, because it's definitely a little bouncy out here. And I mean, so far it's not skipping or hopping or anything. I mean, it's pretty chewed up today, but it's really not bad. Some of these big holes are pretty large for what they are, but I mean, not really that big of a difference. Now, I don't rock crawl this truck. I've got Jeeps for that. This is probably the biggest extent in terms of like challenge for how I can have fun with this truck and where I go with it in terms of off-roading. I will take it on some gravel back roads and some other roads where I go riding dirt bikes and stuff like that, but I don't live near any real desert conditions where I can do it. So let's see if I can pop over. I mean, zero issue, cross-rutting. I mean, everything seems to be not that much different from the 1250. I do feel like the 1250 probably floated a little bit better on top here, but I would have a hard time saying that this is like a night and day difference. Would this drive better if I had the tires aired down? Absolutely, but the whole point is, look, it's really not that big of a deal. The truck's not struggling at all. Again, it's got a ton of power. Probably should have checked the tide to see if we're at high tide or low tide. Usually when people come on the sand, the biggest issue that I've found with people having is they'll cross rut and they won't keep up their momentum when they do it, or they forget to turn off their traction control. And one of the issues with that is when you forget to turn off your traction control and you go around bends like this, what will end up happening is it will see that the tires are spinning at a different speed, and it doesn't know that you're on the sand. It might think you're spinning out in a snowy condition, and it'll lock up the vehicle and just stop it. It's wild how often that happens, and by the time that happens, especially if you have like a big 1-ton truck, it'll just suck it all the way down and you're stuck. So for me, this is kind of a good testament. This is always the area, it's probably the sandiest spot where people get stuck. And I'm gonna do the thing you never wanna do. I'm gonna stop, and then we're just gonna go from it's still cruising right on top. I don't have the rear locker in or anything like that. This is just 4 high, traction control off, and these tires, this is what you want and expect out of an all-terrain. You want it to grab just enough to keep you going, but not dig where it sends you, scooting down to the bottom, because that's where you really get into trouble. So yeah, I mean, this is fantastic. Awesome. Doesn't look like there's anybody out here today, which I got no complaints about. If you've got a half-ton truck or even a 1-ton truck and you are doing this type of shore fishing or beach driving and stuff like this, I mean, this is incredible to be able to just kind of float on top like this at full street pressure.
A few things worth noting in terms of the actual footprint difference of these two tires. Mounted on the wheel, I found the 11.5 to measure 1.25 inches narrower than the 1250. Though I assumed I might notice a difference in traction when I laid on the power, I would argue that on-road the 1150 feels like it's hooking up better. Even in wet conditions, the truck hooks up very well in two-wheel drive and unbelievably well when I click it into 4 Auto. While standing the two tires next to each other, it's extremely obvious that one is much narrower than the other. Under the truck, it doesn't look much different. Both of these tires measure the same overall height, so from the side, it's identical. I even went back with the more aggressive sidewall option for the 1150 as well. No matter what tire you are interested in, it's best to visit the tire manufacturer's website to see the approved wheel widths to make sure that your tire choice is within the recommended specifications. For my case, the Recon Grappler in the 37 by 1150 R17 does have an approved wheel range width of 7.5 to 10 inches, and in the 37 by 1250 has one of 8.5 to 10.5. As I mentioned earlier, this means my Raptor wheels are well within spec for either tire. It's also worth noting that though my off-road explorations with the Recon Grappler under my Raptor may be limited, I've spent plenty of time with this tire under other vehicles in the rocks and even mud. It absolutely holds its own on the trail and is genuinely one of the best all-terrains I've ever tested off-road. While my reason for moving to an 1150 may be a bit specific for my Raptor, the fact remains that for those looking to move to a taller tire and want to keep their stock wheel, the 1150 is going to be the better option in terms of staying within the tire manufacturer specs. Speaking with my local off-road shop, they recommend the 1150 to many of their customers not only for the aforementioned benefits, but the fact that they will clear suspension components and cycle within the fenders much better than a wider tire.
That's what I got for this video. If you have any questions, just drop them in the comments. If you want to see some stuff I'm working on behind the scenes, you can always check me out at Ali Mansour Editor. Our goal with all of these videos is to educate, inform, and entertain on basically all things automotive. So if you did like this video, actually like it and consider subscribing to the Driving Line channel. It absolutely helps. As always, I appreciate you guys watching and I hope to see you on the trail. Take care.